Hi everyone, I want to try to do a part 2 to my last video. I'm sorry for the abrupt ending on the last one. I ran out of time, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about Isaiah 45, and I thought it was interesting that it comes up in verses 17 and 18. I didn't read verse 17 in the last video, and I want to go ahead and read that because over here is where it says, "But Israel shall be saved in the Lord with an everlasting salvation." Of course, salvation is the word Yeshua. "Ye shall not be ashamed nor confounded, world without end." Okay, so this is talking about the salvation of Israel and basically eternity. It's saying world without end. And then it goes on to say, "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it, he hath created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else." And so it's basically saying here in verse 18 that God created the heavens and the earth, but it seems to be talking about the new heavens and the new earth. And I mentioned in my last video how the numbers 1:1, as in Genesis 1:1, is actually a representation of DNA. This is where it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," and I talked about how the heavens would be Eden and the earth actually represents the abyss. And so this is representing the two types of DNA. It's a representation of DNA right from the very beginning. I've talked about how the entire Bible represents DNA, and so you see the heavens and the earth represent DNA in Genesis 1:1. Okay, so if you put a new heaven and earth in the blue letter Bible, you see that it says over here it occurs 6 times in one verse, and it comes up in Revelation 21:1. So again, you have the 1:1. Of course, God is doing it for the second time here when he's creating a new heaven and a new earth. So again, it comes up in 1:1 where it talks about a new heaven and a new earth for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. Okay, it also talks about the new heavens and the new earth in Isaiah 66. Of course, Isaiah is like a mini Bible. It's like a small version of the entire Bible, and the Bible has 66 chapters or 66 books, and the book of Isaiah has 66 chapters. So in the 66th chapter, which is the last chapter of the book of Isaiah, so it correlates with the book of Revelation, this is where God says that he will create the new heavens and the new earth. It says, "For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain." And so you see the word seed comes up here, and this entire scripture comes up in verse 22, which is another number having to do with DNA, because there's 22 autosomes, or two sets of 22 autosomes in the human body. And so the entire Bible is based on DNA. There's actually 3 sets of 22 books for a total of 66, and there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, so it all represents DNA. It actually starts out, okay, it's actually in the previous chapter, chapter 65, verse 17, where it says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered nor come to mind." So I thought it was interesting that that comes up in verse 17, and then it was in verse 18 in Isaiah 45 where it says, "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it, he created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else." But this started out with verse 17 where it's talking about a world without end. So this is talking about eternity here. It says, "But Israel shall be saved in the Lord with an everlasting salvation." Of course, salvation is Yeshua. "Ye shall not be ashamed nor confounded, world without end." So this is talking about eternity beginning here and salvation when Jesus comes back. And this comes up in verse 17 and 18. And so even though it's talking about Cyrus here, this is prophetic of the end of the world, and this entire chapter is all about DNA. Okay, so I think it's significant that it mentions Cyrus because in the end times we have a type of Cyrus, which would be Donald Trump. He's been compared to Cyrus, and in fact the Jews minted a coin, as it says in this article over here, depicting Trump alongside of Cyrus. This is commemorating the 70 years of Israel becoming a nation. And so they printed a coin that features Trump and Cyrus, or Trump as a type of Cyrus, on the coin. Okay, and it just so happens that there's an issue concerning the building of a wall that's going on right now. And I wanted to talk about how there's a spiritual significance to this, and I wanted to compare it to the Wailing Wall. And so I was just pulling up images of the Wailing Wall, which is the only thing that's actually left of the temple. That's the only thing that remains of the temple, and this is where the Jews go to pray, as you can see from these images. And so it's very important and significant that the wall remains. I don't think it's by accident that the only thing that remains of the temple is just a part of the wall, and so I want to talk a little bit more about that. But as I was looking for an image of Donald Trump at the wall, I came up with this one, and I thought it was interesting that it says at the Wailing Wall, Trump tells Netanyahu, my wall will be better than this one. So as you can see, Trump himself is making a connection between the wall that he wants to build and the Wailing Wall, which is the temple wall, or what remains of the temple wall. Okay, and so as I've explained before, I believe this is all a representation of DNA, and I've explained before in previous videos how the word wall is actually the Strong's number 2346. I believe that the temple wall actually represents DNA, and so this is the exact same number as the number of times that the word Elohim in the Bible refers to the true God. And I talked about in my last video how DNA is a representation of God, because life is anything that has DNA. That's what constitutes life, and all life comes from God. And so DNA is actually a representation of God, and that's why the entire Bible is represented by DNA. Okay, and so that's why I don't think it's by accident that the only thing that remains of the temple right now is the wall, and the wall is actually where the Jews go to pray. This is where they submit their prayers. As you can see in one of these images, they insert their prayer requests in between the stones of the Wailing Wall. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the significance of the wall, but I just want to explain really quick, or as quick as possible, how this entire chapter over here is about DNA. It says, thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue the nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two leaves gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I want to talk a little bit more about that and how that represents DNA, but then it goes on to say, I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And again, the bars of iron over here refers to DNA. And so this is God going before Cyrus to loose the loins of kings and to open before him the two-leaved gates. Okay, the two-leaved gates is actually the word dalet. It's the word for door in the Hebrew. It's interesting that it comes up in Strong's number 1817. So again, you have the numbers 18 and 17. You see that it's the door. Jesus is the door. And it comes from this word, which is 1802. And this means to draw or to dangle, but it also means to deliver, to lift up, to draw out. Okay, and it's referring to how the doors are hinged and how the doors, the temple doors, open. But another thing that I wanted to point out is that the doors are actually made out of olive wood, especially the doors leading to the holies of holies, which is the altar or the most holy place of the temple. And I've talked about before how the two olive trees actually are a representation of DNA, and so the two doors of the temple, which are made out of olive wood, are also a representation of DNA. And also wanted to point out that although it's saying Cyrus over here, it's actually prophetically speaking about Christ, I believe. This word anointed is actually the word Christ in the Greek. You can see that over here. It says, "Thus saith the Lord to his Christ," to Cyrus. And the word Cyrus is actually the word in the Hebrew. It actually means possesses thou the furnace. But if you look at the extended definition here, it says the Greeks have remarked that the Persians called the sun by this name. So it was actually a name for the sun, and Jesus is referred to as the Son of Righteousness in the book of Malachi. So the sun refers to Jesus. So I believe prophetically this is talking about Jesus when it says, "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut." And so this is referring to DNA, and then it goes on to say, "I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron." And so again, this is talking about the restoration of the DNA. Okay, so I don't have time to go through the rest of the chapter, but I just wanted to point out again how it talks about the new heavens and the new earth being created here in verses 17 and 18. And so there's a direct connection here to the situation with the wall and why this is spiritually significant, because if you look in Revelation 21 where it talks about the new heaven and the new earth, it also talks about the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And when you get to verse 17, it talks about the measurement of the wall. It says, "And he measured the wall thereof 144 cubits." And I've talked about before how that's a representation of the bride, the 144,000, because of the number 144. But the measurement of 144 cubits, if you look at this in the other translations, it gives the other measurements. For example, it gives the measurements in feet here in the New Living Translation, and so you have 216 feet. I thought that was interesting because the shutdown is, or the government was reopened until February 15th, and the very next day is 216. And so again, you have a connection here to the wall. Okay, and so this is all spiritually significant, and it's all connected to DNA, but that's about all I have time for. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.